as well. This presentation is going to take us back to our fundamental understanding of these types of concepts as well. And before I introduce the speaker, I just want to give you a bit of a reminder to just, if you have any questions for our speaker, then just put them into the comments on the Facebook Live, and hopefully we can ask these questions at the conclusion of the presentation. So I'd like to just begin by introducing tonight's speaker. The lead clinical educator at Western Health in the western suburbs of Melbourne, Australia. Adam has a fantastic reputation in Australia as an educator and is a huge advocate for the profession of radiography, and he does a lot of work with the students of radiography as well. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Adam to speak on this topic. And let's hear from Adam and see what this presentation is going to show us. Thank you, Adam.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this webinar tonight, this evening. My name is Adam Stewart. I'm the tutor radiographer at Western Health, which is a large multi-campus public hospital here in Melbourne in Australia. We service the western suburbs of Melbourne. I want to thank Steve Lacey and the ISRRT for inviting me to present this webinar. I'm really excited about it, and I hope that you're able to learn something from it. When I was asked to present the webinar, I guess the first thing I thought of was, well, what am I going to present? How do I go about it? I think as a clinical educator radiographer or a tutor radiographer or wherever is termed in the part of the world you are, I guess my day-to-day is teaching students and dealing with students in the hospital environment, in the clinical environment. I'm a passionate general radiographer. And so I decided that I felt that going back to basics would be the best thing that I could present. And in particular, when I sort of really narrowed down it, I felt that exposure considerations, the clinical radiographers, is probably the go-to. I see students really struggling with ideas around exposure selection a lot and really not understanding that, or not coming to grasp with it, or not knowing it at all. And I see radiographers to some degree do the same, that they struggle with the concepts and some of the things around it, and perhaps don't know it as well as they should, and may not, and certainly will struggle to teach it. So I'm just hoping that this might provide some insight into clinical exposure setting, and hopefully it can help you in some way. So before I start, a quick disclaimer: I'm not a physicist. I'm a clinical radiographer. I'll be taking liberties with a lot of physics theory today in this presentation, and the purpose of that is really just to help us to adapt a lot of the physics theory into that clinical practice that we tend to do. We've been doing this, clinical radiographers have been doing this for a long, long time. I'll be doing this today. So just a heads up that I will be taking liberties with some of the formal physics theory, but again, it's trying to adapt it. It's also important to note that a lot of the considerations and exposure considerations we're talking about today really stem from conventional radiography theory, and particularly plain film theory. It's clinical skills and principles that are still true today, but may be different on digital systems, and maybe need to be treated slightly differently on digital systems that allow for post-processing and image manipulation. Okay, they also have broad latitudes and so forth. So while a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today certainly is true and certainly holds true, it's really important that when you start applying it, you have a good understanding of the system you're using and how best to use and manipulate it. Okay, and that holds true with the different, as I said, different vendors, different systems may have different settings and so forth, and different post-processing that will ultimately impact the final exposure selection. And you should be very aware of that when you're using some of the stuff that I'm talking about today. This is a quick overview I'm going to go through. I'm hoping to be able to smash through everything here. I probably won't get through filtration, but I'm going to look into X-ray production. I really hope that I can get through that in the hour I've got. This is about 12 hours worth of, formal tutorial sessions that I do with my fourth-year students that I'm trying to condense down. And I guess there's a workshop that I'm trying to condense down. I've got half a day's workshop I'm condensing down into an hour. So hopefully we get through all of it. We're going to be looking at X-ray production, image quality, and then obviously some of the factors that we can control as radiographers they're going to have an impact in the final result of our image. The background to this is a study. We'll look at part of it, which was published in the RadTech article from 2018, and it's a study we did in about 2016 or 2017. It was a phantom study looking at the different principles from, exposure selection principles from plain film days and assessing them against the digital systems that we had. So we used an anthropomorphic phantom and we tested them against our GE system, which utilised the deviation index. And for this, we used the deviation index to check the changes. Now, it's not the most scientifically robust value to use, and I understand that. But the purpose of using it was much better to relate back to clinical people, particularly in our work site. And the aim was always about clinical and seeing that clinical valuation. People understood it a little bit better. So suffice to say, we use the G system, and it's really important that you understand your system because you may not use DI, it may use EI or whatever. So I think it's really important that you check and you make sure you're comfortable and you understand what your system uses and how it works before you sort of you roll this into play. And our GE system uses the DI, the deviation index, and this is the mathematical formula for the deviation index. Long story short, it's just important to note as we go through, whenever I refer back to our study and back to the image we took, that a change in 1 DI is equivalent to 25% of the dose. So think of that as one step in your MAS that you typically would use. And 3 DI, change of 3 DI, will be effectively a doubling or halving of the dose to the detector that you typically would get. So your signal will be double or half, okay, to your detector. We'll touch on that a bit in a moment. Now, I'm going to start with the X-ray tube because I do, and I'm hoping I can get away with doing this because I do like going right back to the start because I think it's misunderstood and it's underappreciated. And I think that when we do understand it, it makes it a lot easier, particularly for KVP and MAS, which tends to be our main focus of exposure selection. This is a rough schematic of an X-ray tube. You can see I've drawn here. It's pretty crude, but you see we have a glass envelope, and the purpose of the glass envelope is to maintain this vacuum. Okay, so there's no sort of particle matter inside the tube itself. Okay, that's the purpose of the glass envelope. At one end we have an anode, and the other end we have a cathode. Okay, which means we've got one end is positively charged and one end is negatively charged, which means across the tube itself we have a potential difference, and that is measured in kilovoltage. Okay, or I guess again, firstly I'll take with the physics theory, KVP. So when we're selecting our KVP or our kilovoltage peak or potential or whatever, we're setting the potential difference across the tube. When we take the exposure, we apply a current to the cathode, and that's measured in MA, and we apply it for a certain amount of time that's measured in seconds. Okay, and that's where the term where MAS comes from. It's the amount of current we apply and how long we apply that current to the cathode. Now, when we apply it to the cathode, basically it goes along this little filament. The filament heats up, and via a process called thermodynamic emission, a lot of electrons are rejected from their atomic state. Okay, and because we have the vacuum, they're free to move around. They're not taken up by the particles in air or whatever else. They're free to move and free to roam. Now, we don't want them roaming all around the X-ray tube or floating all around the X-ray tube. So we have a focusing cup. The focusing cup sits in behind, and it basically targets them along or moves them along a certain beam in a certain path. Okay, it moves in a certain direction. There goes the electron beam as we're producing and spilling out these electrons. Okay. Now, the electrons are going to attract themselves towards the anode. And this is where, for some reason, it's not working. There you go. Towards the anode. Now, they're going to accelerate towards the anode because there's a potential difference. The electrons are negatively charged. They're going to attract towards a positively charged anode. And they're going to accelerate at a rate really dependent on our KVP and the potential that we set. The higher the potential, the faster they'll accelerate, and the lower, vice versa. So when they're actually incident on the detector, oh, is it going to work for me? Yep. When they're incident on the detector, the electron has kinetic energy. It's got a mass, it's accelerating, so it therefore has some kinetic energy. So in order to come to rest, in order to stop, okay, it has to give off that energy, that kinetic energy. And the energy will be given off, 99% of it will be given off as heat, and 1% will be given off as an X-ray photon. All right, and that's how we produce X-rays. Now, this is the most simple version, and obviously we produce the X-ray, and in the most simplified way, all the energy is imparted into that X-ray, okay? And it's not inhibited in any way, and it's free to go, so it has the maximum energy that it can be provided or imparted to it. But it can sometimes, maybe it's not the full energy that goes off, it's part of it goes off, and there's another interaction, another one comes off. Maybe these things happen. Also, maybe in the process of, being created, as the photon's moving itself out of the tube, it's partially attenuated, okay? So it's important to understand that while this first one, we can have a maximum energy imparted to the photon, not all of the interactions are going to produce photons of that same energy. It's not monochromatic. It's not that way. It's polychromatic. So it's going to have different values, different energy values amongst the photons that are produced. Okay, and typically the average energy is about a third of the maximum, okay, as a general rule of thumb. That's how we produce X-rays, and that's how KVP and MAS are used to produce X-rays. It's also important to note that X-rays are produced all around. They're not produced, contrary to what a lot of students tend to think, they're not produced down in a specific little pyramid. That's not how we produce it. They go everywhere, okay? The X-ray tube itself is contained within a lead housing, okay, and we only allow the photons that are going down a certain part through an aperture to be transmitted and passed down, and that's what we use. So you can imagine the overwhelming heat, because for every photon there's 99 elements of heat produced, and likewise, to produce one we're going to use, there might be thousands that we're not going to use. That's why we have lots of measures to try and reduce the heat to the tube, and that includes immersing it in oil and so forth, okay? This is basically what our X-ray tube looks like. Obviously, on the back, we have our light beam diaphragm that has, the perspex aperture with the perspex. It has a mirror in the way that helps us to demonstrate where our X-ray field will be collimated to, and so forth, okay? That's how we produce the X-rays. How we produce the radiograph, however, is different. So we utilize our X-ray and we basically direct it through a patient to be incident upon the detector. And depending on how much attenuation has occurred going through that patient and be incident on the detector, when the photon's incident on the detector, it will stimulate it and create a certain shade of grey, okay? And the higher stimulation, the darker that shade will be. In the first instance, we have our X-ray that doesn't actually pass through the patient. It just goes straight through, doesn't pass anything, and it's incident solely on the detector. In this case, it's going to stimulate the detector and produce a shade of black. The photon might pass through the patient, it's partially attenuated on its way through. When it's incident on the detector, part of the intensity is lost, but it's going to demonstrate as a certain shade of grey commensurate to the energy of the photon. It could be fully absorbed in the patient, in which case it's going to show up as white. And the fourth outcome, and again, there's multiple different ways, this is really simplifying it incredibly, but the fourth way is that you have the incident photon on the patient, it's partially attenuated, but it moves off in a different direction, and that's called scatter. That is a scatter photon, okay? And the scatter photon is incident on the detector, and it produces a different shade of grey in a space that's not supposed to, and that's why it compromises the quality of the image and the contrast of an image. The scatter photons are no good. This is the important points to note. The KVP basically controls the energy of the tube. And in long story short, the KVP will control the average energy or the energy and intensity of the X-rays you're producing, whereas the MAS is responsible for the amount of electrons that are put out and produced and are going to be incident on the anode, and therefore MAS is responsible for the amount of photons you're going to be producing. Let's touch on scatter radiation. I touched on it a second ago, and I think it's really important, okay? The scatter radiation, when X-rays are incident on matter, they're going to go let's focus on the two main interactions they'll have in matter, and that is photoelectric effect and the Compton scatter. Now, photoelectric effect is basically where the incident photons incident on an outer shell electron of the atomic matter that it's incident upon, and it has enough energy, and X-rays are ionizing radiation so far as the wavelength is sufficiently short and the frequency is sufficiently high that it acts like a particle. That's why it's not ionized. That's why it's ionizing. Okay, so it dislodges the electron out of the shell, and that is the photoelectric effect. Okay, Compton scatter is where the same kind of thing happens. It dislodges the electron, but there's enough energy left for the photon to continue off. Now, that's ideal if it continues on its normal path. But Compton scatter is where where it produces a scattered photon that moves off in a slightly different direction. Okay. And Compton scatter will proliferate greater where the average energies are higher. That's why when we set a higher KVP, we actually produce a greater amount of scatter within the matter because you've got higher energies that will produce, and so Compton scattering proliferates over the photoelectric effect. The scatter photons are off-axis photons. They contribute negatively to the image quality. And any improvements to image quality, any improvements to reduce, any efforts to reduce the scatter photons will improve the image quality, okay? But when we're seeking to reduce these, we also need to we're also reducing the amount of photons that actually reach the detector, okay? So while we're taking photons away and improving the quality of our images vis-a-vis the contrast, we'll touch on that in a second, we also have to understand that that's also taking away from the overall exposure or the overall signal of our exposure, of our image, and therefore we may need to compensate for that. Right, with that background done, let's actually get into thinking about some of the considerations for exposure that we can make and we can sort of utilise from our system, okay? The first thing we probably need to do is think about, what is image quality, first of all. And when I talk about image quality, there's sort of three principles that make up your image quality. And the first one is signal noise, okay? Or I call it signal noise. In the old days, it was called density in plain film. It was called the density of an image. I often refer to it also as, I guess, the exposure detector or detector exposure, the exposure that's actually incident on the detector. But I do like the term signal or signal noise because it really goes back to that sort of signal noise ratio, okay? And obviously, if we've got enough signal, we'd really get rid of the noise. There's really not a lot of noise there. So the more intense the signal, less noise, okay? So signal is that concept of how much radiation we have incident on our detector to be able to create an image. And remembering we need enough radiation to actually create an image in the first place before we can start worrying about the rest. Contrast is literally the ability to differentiate similar structures. All right, so the ability to differentiate or the impression of different structures and how well they stand out from each other on an image, okay? So typically, I often refer to that as with the trabecular pattern in bone, for example. They are similar structures. It's bony. They're very similar, but how well do we differentiate and see them? Well, that's going to be the contrast, okay? And it's heavily affected by scatter. And sharpness is the other one, which we won't be dealing with here because it tends to be more of a geometric construct rather than looking at the actual exposure selection that we're going to go through here today. So we're really today going to look for signal and contrast. So what we're really going to be doing is every time we think about a factor and manipulating that factor and how it affects the image quality, we're going to be thinking about, okay, so how does that affect the quality in terms of the contrast and the ability to visualize structures better or worse? And the signal, how well are we able to see? We actually exposed our image well enough to be able to actually get a signal to be able to see what we need to see. These are the things we're going to go through today. I touched at the top of the head. We're going to start, first of all, with the KVP and MAS because we've just gone through that with the tube and the introduction of the tube. We're going to start now by looking at the KVP and MAS. We understand what MAS is, okay, it's the product of the current tube current and exposure time. And it is responsible basically for the number of photons that we're going to produce. So therefore, we tend to consider it as the major controlling factor for the exposure of the image or the detector exposure or the signal, as I call it, okay? So it's responsible for the signal on the image, okay? And we tend to know that it has a linear relationship to signal and dose, and that's something we often talk about. It's linear. We double the MAS, we double the exposure. And going to our study that I talked about earlier, okay, we wanted to test that and have a look at that. And also to understand when we think about the contrast, how does MAS affect the contrast? Okay, and something that we often teach my students is MAS shouldn't really affect the contrast in any way, except for when something's underexposed or something's grossly overexposed, in which case it really takes away, there's almost no contrast there, okay, if that makes sense. So let's look at this. So we did an AP lumbar spine. We kept all exposures exactly the same. Everything was consistent. We started with MAS and we just started doubling the MAS therein. Okay, so given that we were doubling the MAS, the expectation should be, therefore, that the DI values recorded should move in increments of 3, because that's the way the DI works. And if you double, we see an increment of 3 changing as we go through. Okay, so those images there, sorry, I should say, that's 5 and this is 10. You can see at 5, we've really got, we're underexposed. It's a really grossly noisy image. It's relatively useless. When we go to 10, we're starting to see it's underexposed technically, and it's quite underexposed. Technically, it's quite underexposed, but you kind of can see most of the structures you need to see, including the SIJs, not well, but you can kind of see them. That become our baseline, okay? So here's our 10 MAS X-ray or radiograph. And remember, we're going to move them, double them as it goes along. So this is 20, this is 40, 80, 160, okay? And you can see there's not a great difference in what we're seeing as far as the contrast goes. 320, and then obviously we've got the 640, and you've got not complete oversaturation of the detector, image is compromised, okay? So what's important here? Well, this shows you the latitude that you have, and the real importance to understand your system and know what your DI is or what your expected EI range is, and know how to manipulate that exactly for this. Because you can see here, if you look at that's 20 MAS and this is 160 MAS, and the difference visually is not great. We really can't see much of a difference. The contrast is the same. It goes to that reason. The MAS really won't affect the contrast when you have an appropriate signal to noise. And that latitude with digital imaging is incredible, okay? Nearly 30 odd plus times we measured on our study. So it's really important to make sure you understand and you're looking at the exposure you're setting in terms of that measurement, the DI or the EI or whatever your system uses, okay? The important part, though, is what it looked like. And as you can see, this is excerpt taken from our publication, which is in Radiology Technologist, and you can see that the changes pretty much occur in 3 DI increments. So it stands through and demonstrates and confirms, largely confirms, that linear relationship. If you double the MAS, you will double the detector exposure, you'll double the signal, okay? So it's important to be aware of what that is important of your system and making sure you fit within the realms of it. With the KVP, when we started looking at the KVP, we understand what KVP is. That's going to control the average energy of your film, of your system, of your image, sorry. And it infers the energy itself, the intensity. And what we know is that, oops, it's not working. We know is that when you increase the KVP, you're going to actually increase the average energy. So you're going to increase the penetrability of the beam. So more photons are likely to get through. Therefore, it will have an effect on the detector exposure, on the signal, because more are getting through. So you've got a greater exposure to the detector, okay? And one of the common things we should all know, and hopefully we all know, is that affects according to a 15% rule, or often it's called a 10 kVp rule. We can use that from sort of 60 to 90 odd kVp. It works at 15% increments. So the 15% rule basically states that, you know, if you increase the KVP by 15%, you will have a doubling or halving of the exposure to the detector or your signal, okay? So that's really important. But we also know, and we talked about before, that if you increase the KVP, you're going to increase the amount of scatter produced. And therefore, KVP has always and long been held as the controlling factor for the contrast of your image. And this was something in our study we wanted to test and look at, because is that really the case now with digital? So in this case, we increased we took exposures and we increased the KVP. We kept everything the same, but increased the KVP by 15% at each time, okay? So you can see here we've got our lower end values, what 60 kVp, 70 and 80, which is largely that 10 kVp rule and is pretty much a 15% rule. So you can see I'm enticed to even just say there's subtle changes. There's really subtle changes in contrast. Maybe it's very difficult to determine the change in contrast. We'll touch on that in a second. But if you look at the 15% rule, you can see that largely they move in pretty close to three DI increments, okay? So the 15% rule we found largely held and was mostly true for digital systems. So you can still use that 15% rule. If you increase the KVP by 15%, it will double the signal of this, double your signal and double the exposure to the detector. With the contrast, however, if you look at this, you can see this is 60, 70, 80, 95, and 110, 15% increments all the way through these images. And from my perspective as an experienced radiographer, there's very subtle changes. It's very difficult to determine a difference in contrast between these images. Now, obviously, if we look at 60 and 110, yeah, okay, I can say, yeah, this one's got far better contrast than this. But if you look at the subtleties in each 15% increment, gee, it's really hard to see, okay? If I shuffle them now and you're given this and they could be in any order, and I say to you now, which one is which, it becomes much trickier and even harder. And this proved to us that contrast is still a controlling factor. The KVP is still a controlling factor for contrast. However, it's not to the same effect that it would have been, say, in plain film days, because this is the result and outcome, and you can see how difficult it was. To prove this even further for our study and to try and publish it, we just grabbed 10 radiologists and just blinded them to this and said, okay, guys, the same as that second test we did, which one has the best contrast? And you can see, if I get my stupid head out the way, that this was the results that we received, okay? Half of them went for 60, 4 went for 70, and 1 even went for 80, okay? When we asked them at what point did you feel that that the image is no longer clinically valid, they all kind of went for the 110. But that being said, this was a bit of a non-starter, because we didn't say them. There's multiple limitations to that element, multiple limitations of the study, but certainly to that element. But what it does show is that the KVP is no longer that super controlling factor for contrast, and that was interesting. So summary of that, and if we look at the image quality going forward, what does that mean? Okay, so if we look at the KVP in a mass versus image quality, okay, increasing KVP will increase the scatter production, okay, and therefore reduce the contrast. But again, as I said, we take that with a grain of salt, because it's not going to have such an overwhelming impact at those subtle small changes like 15%. We may not see it quite so heavily as we once did. It's also going to increase the penetration, and therefore the 15% rule holds true. If we increase the KVP by 15%, we'll increase the detector exposure or the signal by double, and vice versa for halving. The MAS still has a linear relationship. If we increase the MAS, we increase the number of X-rays we're producing, and it has a linear relationship. So if we double the MAS, we double the detector exposure or the signal. And if we halve the MAS, we do the opposite, okay? And once we've got an adequate amount or adequately exposed, then the MAS really won't control the contrast to any great degree. And that's really important, because it means you need to be very vigilant, very careful by watching where your exposure is sitting within the limits of what your system allows. Right, let's move on to grids. How are we going for time? I'm going okay, I think, at the moment. So let's move on to grids. Grids are basically lead strips. Hopefully we all know what they are. Grids are basically a series of lead strips that just diverge, and the purpose of it is to prevent scatter reaching the detector, okay? The aim is to improve image quality by reducing the scatter. But be aware that in reducing the scatter, we're going to reduce also the exposure to the detector. So grids work by the primary beam will pass through, and they will get through and reach the detector as long as it's uninhibited, whereas a scattered photon is going to be absorbed by the grid. It is, without question, the single best scatter reduction technique that we have is the grid, okay? So yeah, that's how it works. The effectiveness of the grid is determined by the grid ratio, which is the height of the lead strip by the distance between it, the interval between them. Okay, and this is pretty true. So we understand the grid ratio. So we have certain grid ratios that we have available to us at Western. We did our study, and basically what we did was we tested it. The only thing we changed in this instance was the grid itself. Okay, so the first one you can see we did with no grid, the second with a 10-to-1 grid, and then a 13-to-1 grid. And you can see these are the DI values we got. So you can see that from the no grid to the 10-to-1 grid, it changed in the order of about 5. And from the no grid to the 13-to-1 grid, it changed by a factor of about 6. So what this is saying to us is that, you know, when we utilize a grid, we're going to need to at least, and the old rule of thumb was you double. Well, it may be more if you're using a considerable ratio grid, vis-a-vis the 10 or 13-to-1 grid. In which case you may need to double, certainly with something like the 13-to-1 grid here in this study, it's suggesting that we need to double and then double again. And the 10-to-1, we need to double and probably add an extra 50%. Now, we did have a small 8-to-1 that I didn't put on here, and a small sort of 8-to-1 or 6-to-1 will basically double will be about right. Okay. So long story short of our studies here will suggest that the use of the grid will require at least a doubling of exposure, but maybe more. So for an 8-to-1 or a 16-to-1, 8-for-1 or a 6-to-1 grid, you may require a doubling of that exposure. Okay. But when you get to a larger grid range, like 10-to-1 or 13-to-1, chances are you're probably going to have to double it and double it again. I've been working on this. This is one of my projects. We've been working on this a bit further with one of my students, and we certainly are seeing at the moment, we're breaking into two. If you're using a low ratio grid, 6-to-1 or 8-to-1, you're probably going to double. And if you're using a higher grid ratio of 10-to-1, 12-to-1, 13-to-1, you're going to double and double again. All right. Now, they're big numbers, and it's really important. So the really important thing here is, when do I use the grid? And that's a really important consideration. So back in the day, one of the conventional considerations I had was I usually went for, if I have about 10 centimetres of tissue thickness, probably when I'm going to start thinking about, or greater, probably when I start thinking about applying a grid. And that stuck with the sort of literature that suggested about 10 to 15. Recent literature that I found in Radiography magazine, Radiography journal, I think it's about a year or so ago now, a couple of years ago now, suggested that greater than 14 centimetres is probably the threshold. And personally, at the moment, I'm kind of using that I've sort of upped it a little bit to something like about 12 centimetres. So as a loose rule of thumb, I'm looking somewhere from about 12 centimetres of thickness or greater, I may start to employ a grid. Again, it's going to depend on what I want to see and how I want to see it. If I think of a knee, for example, and I want to see more of the femoral aspect, then when I go above 12 centimetres, I might start to employ it because I want to see that in better detail. But if I'm more focused on the tibia, I can get away with that, and that's going to save patient dose, so I'll do that. It's all going to be taken in that kind of context. But as a general rule of thumb, once you hit that sort of 12 to 14 centimetres, you probably want to start employing a grid. And when you put the grid, you now know that you're going to need to either double or double and double depending on the ratio of grid you're going to use, okay? And that ratio might change depending on all sorts of situations. And also, it might even include the patient thickness and how thick you think you need to get through. Right, let's look at collimation now. And this, for me, is the real unsung. I'm sure there's plenty of students out there who will understand collimation. Here, old codgers like me talking about collimate, you need to collimate, because it was a really true thing in plain film days. It made a massive impact to the quality of your image, and it still does on digital systems in a big way. So it's really important. What we need to be aware of is when we collimate, if we're collimating to an abdomen the size like so, what we need to be aware of, if we collimate down even further to this, the photons here in this region, the lumbar spine region, even when we collimate to here, the primary beam just goes straight. It's the same amount of primary photons incident on that area. So it doesn't change. We don't concentrate the X-ray photons in that area. We can't do that. They're just moving in the direction, right? What we're basically doing when we're doing this is we're no longer utilising any of these photons out here. So the photons here, it makes no difference. The primary beam is still going to come through exactly the same. The only difference is the scattered photons from here that were now incident in this area will no longer be there. And for that reason, when we collimate more tightly, we reduce the scatter radiation, okay? So when we reduce our field size, we reduce the amount of scatter that's produced or that's incident in that area, okay? So there's less area to get through. So when we reduce that, we're going to improve the image quality. So by collimating down tighter, we have less scatter and we improve the image quality. We improve the contrast of our image. However, we are also taking away scattered photons, okay? So therefore, we're reducing the signal. And severe collimation, when we collimate really severely, it's likely that we actually have to increase the exposure to accommodate that loss of scatter radiation. Now, if we look at scatter in terms of the contrast and how it looks, here's a Jude view that someone did at my work where they did both pelvises on at once. Now, let's not get into the nitty-gritty of that, but you can see if we're looking at the pelvis all done together, it's collimated to this larger size, okay? So this is an example of the hip from that particular image. And this is an example of hip that I did with a student. We redid with all the same factors, because we could see the factors on the image. We redid it with the same factors, everything exactly the same, but we collimated to a smaller field size of about 24 by 20. And you can see the stark difference it makes in the contrast, the ability to determine and see the acetabulum and so forth. So it's a very real thing. It really improves the image quality. But like I said, when you take the scattered photons away, you reduce the exposure to the detector, and you may need to actually increase. So if you want to be smart, look smart in front of your students, talk about that. If I collimate down really tightly, do I increase or decrease my exposure? They'll always say that you need to decrease it because your intensity, you're putting all the intensity in this area. It's not true. Okay. So every single student, every single time, when you tell them that if you decrease tightly, you need to increase exposure, will look like this. They just won't get it. But the reason is you're taking scatter photons away, so you're reducing actual photons at the detector. Here's our study and how it looks. Basically, the only difference here is collimation. We just opened out the collimation at each time and took a whole number of images, okay? And you can see clearly the difference in image quality. It's noticeable when you've got 20 centimeters, you've got 18 versus 38. It's noticeable difference there. But even subtly between some of these, sort of 18 to say 26, you can see those differences. You can see the effect of that collimation makes on the image quality. And that's why you should always be seeking to collimate as tightly as you can. And the tricky part is often it's easy to collimate on someone who doesn't need it quite so much, a thin patient, but some of our larger patients who really are going to produce a lot more scatter and require that collimation, it's much trickier to do, but it's really important that you do that. And this is why. As far as the collimation versus and the detector exposure and the signal, and how much do we need to increase? This is the crude method, and it's an area that I'm going to. My next project is going to be with one of my students. Will be on this. So one of my students next year will be looking at this. But it's looking at when we collimate, how much do we have to change the detector exposure? Long story short, from the phantom we found, we sort of just found that probably a change in about a 10 centimeter change would require about 25% of the dose. So another rule of thumb we kind of used as far as collimation was, if you're collimating to half the field size, you want at least 25% dose, maybe even more. Okay, that's just a loose rule of thumb. It may not be a big difference if you think about it as terms of, okay, well, I'm adequately exposed, so I don't need to worry about it. But if your exposure is in the lower end of the exposure range you're at, and then you choose not to do that, it may well make it too noisy and you need to repeat. So really be careful with that. Okay, if we look at distance now, I'm not going to really focus too heavily on the object detector distance. It's also called an air gap. And basically, I mean, the theoretical process of it is the further the image is away, the more likely that scatter is to miss the detector. And it's a bit of a scatter reduction technique. But clinically, certainly I haven't seen or heard of that being used to any great advantage. And it may be done, but you obviously need larger SDDs and so forth to accommodate that. So I'm not really going to focus on that here. But what I am going to look at is the source to detect the distance, okay? And we understand with the source to detect the distance that the change to the detector exposure, the change in the signal is beholden to the inverse square law. And hopefully we all know what inverse square law is, because I'm not going to go in too great detail over that. But suffice to say that obviously the greater the distance we come out, the change in intensity is proportional to the distance, the inverse of the distance squared, okay? And that's useful. We'll touch on that in a second, is how we do that. We assessed, long story short here, I'm not going to waste too much time on this either, but we had a look at our image. We took images over sort of, multiple distances every 10 centimeters. Here's an example of 100, 150, and 180, common distances that we use in practice. You can see the big difference in magnification, and you can see the difference in intensity. At 180, we're particularly noisy, and that's because we're almost, 5 DI below what we really want to be, okay, or should be. So you can see the noise that's created. So it does make a big difference to the intensity of the film. So it is important that when you're using and changing that distance, you accommodate for your exposure accordingly. And that's accommodating, thinking about the source to detect the distance. You really should be seeking to increase, and there's plenty of literature that talks about increasing your SDD, your source to detect the distance. There's strong links between that and a reduced skin entrance dose, so we definitely should be looking to that. And also it reduces magnification, so it allows you to include more anatomy, which is really important. The good thing is the inverse square law can be sort of recalculated down into this density maintenance formula. This is the density maintenance formula right here, okay? And that density maintenance formula basically tells you if I change my distance, this is the new MAS value that I should use for that change in distance, as long as you know the previous one, to maintain the exposure that you're setting with the previous one. Okay. Now you're not going to go and calculate you're not going to go off and calculate the the new MAS using the density maintenance formula every single time. So if you're a smart radiographer, like I kind of think I am, what you're going to do is you're going to have set conversions, rough conversion factors for set distances you go. And you can see down here, if I'm going from 100 to 120, I'm just going to multiply the MAS that I originally would use by 1.5. 100 to 150 is a bit over 2, and 100 to 180 is a bit over 3. Okay, so that's just a good example of how to utilize that density maintenance formula and alter your exposure given the distance. This is really useful for things like when you're doing horizontal beam hips, or things where you mobile chest X-rays where you inadvertently are changing much greater or much shorter distances. It allows you to quickly calculate what change do I need to make given this condition. So I'm nearly there. So our final part now is looking at compression, because I'm not going to touch on filtration. I think that's just a bit too confusing. I'm just going to look at this final part, and I'll leave filtration, because I think it's an area that I'm really looking forward to doing a lot of work in. But I think it's going to be a bit too confusing, a bit too high for what we want to do, and we're going to run out of time anyway. So when I'm talking about compression, and I think a lot of people are like, well, how can you compress things? Well, you can, because you could, for example, do an abdomen or a lumbar spine prone instead of AP, and that will compress the abdominal tissue. In fact, it's a good way to do the lumbar spine, because you've got less dose, you've got better image quality because there's less scatter, but you've also got the diverging beam that helps to open up the lumbar spine. That's a whole separate thing. But when we're talking about compression, we're talking about compressing tissues and creating less attenuating media, less attenuating tissue for the X-rays to travel through. There's going to be less attenuation. So given that, you're going to have an increase in detector exposure or an increase in signal of your detector, of your image. And you're going to have less attenuation, you're going to have less scatter production. So you're going to improve both the contrast and you're going to increase the detector exposure, which means you can use less dose. Okay. So less scatter production, yeah, improves the image quality. How do we value that? And this is the really important part. One of the things I see people and students in particular really misinterpret a lot. You do it based on the half value layer. Now, the half value layer is typically an industrial radiography sort of construct, and it's usually largely used with materials that have a uniform sort of linear attenuation coefficient. Okay, but basically what it is, it's the thickness of material that's required to reduce X-ray to half of its value. Okay, it's typically a measure of the beam's intensity. It's related to linear attenuation coefficients. Difficult in human tissue because it's not all the same. Not all the same. We've got bones, we've got soft tissue, we've got fat, we've got muscle, we've got different things, got air. So it's going to be very different. But as a general rule of thumb, and I come across reading, and I used to use back in the day, somewhere around 2 to 5 centimeters, depending on beam intensity. And if you look at literature, there's this article in particular I found correlates that as well as others, that somewhere around the order of 2 to 5 centimeters will be about the half value layer of most standard human tissue. Okay, not the chest. The chest is obviously different, but for most tissue, so a good rule of thumb that I tend to use with this, and clinically I've seen that works probably better, is somewhere around 5 centimeters of thickness. So what that means is for every 5 centimeters of extra thickness that you use, or that is there. This is when we talk about patients. Oh, I set an average exposure, and I just go up if they're bigger or down if they're smaller. Well, how do you value that? This is how you value that. If they're 5 centimeters thicker, you will double the exposure. If they're 5 centimeters thinner, you'll halve that exposure. So, for example, here, if we're doing an AP abdomen, this is one of my staff members that's volunteered for me. You can see if the AP thickness is 15 centimeters and the lateral thickness is 30 centimeters, we see a lot of students, a lot of radiographers just sort of go, okay, well, it's twice as thick, so it's going to double exposure. But that won't nearly be enough often, okay, because the lateral thickness is double, but it's actually increased by 15 centimeters, which means we need to double it 3 times, okay? And that's really important. So we need to double it and double it and double it. Now, with the digital systems, you've got much better latitude, so you may not need to go quite that heavy-handed, but certainly if you just double it, it probably won't be enough. You'll still have a noisy image. You may need to go again and repeat again, which is going to create a whole extra dose to the patient that's unnecessary if you understand how to use this a bit better, okay? Again, take this with a grain of salt and utilize it within your systems, but hopefully this gives you a tool that you can use and you can start to think about when and how I'm going to adjust my exposure depending on the patient's size, rather than just, well, if they're a bit bigger, I give an extra couple of bits or whatever else. You actually now have a slightly more logical approach as to how you do it. So I hope that can benefit you in that way as well. So to finish up, I think I've got in under an hour. I hope I have. In fact, I have. I'm going to be about 45 minutes. We might even have some question time, which is great. It's been a bit of a whirlwind through this. I appreciate that. To summarise most of what I've said, the exposure selection rules that I tend to use and tend to teach to a lot of my students, the 15% rule, we understand that. If you increase the KVP or decrease by 15%, you either double or halve the exposure to the detector and the signal of your image. MAS is a linear relationship. If you double the MAS or halve the MAS, you will double or halve the exposure to the detector and the signal of your image. The increase in your SID will still work on the density maintenance formula, and it's something to be, the inverse square law. It still holds true, and the density maintenance formula can be utilised in order for you to make MAS changes to compensate for the distances that you're increasing. All right, and try and be aware to try and maximise your SDD, because it is going to have much better outcomes from a skin entrance dose perspective for your patients. Remember the half value layer rule. I think it's really valuable. I see students and radiographers a lot talk about, well, I have my average exposure set for an average size patient, and then I just manipulate that for the size, whether they're bigger or small or whatever. The half value layer will give you a slightly more tangible value to be able to manipulate your exposures. So, okay, I think they're about 5 centimeters thicker. I'm going to change by going or doubling or halving or whatever. Okay, and again, you've got the grid use. When you're using a grid, you're going to have to at least double it. You're going to double it for a lower ratio grid, like a 6 or 8 to 1. But you're going to have to double it and then probably double it again for a high ratio grid, like a 10 to 1, 12 or 13 to 1 grid. But just to be aware of that, okay? And you probably want to utilise your grid when you've got at least sort of 12 to 14 centimetres of tissue thickness. You probably want to think about utilising a grid, okay? So again, a lot of these rules will work. They'll work. Hopefully they can help you in your clinical environment. I hope that they will, again, use them with a bit of grain of salt, but it's really important that you utilise them in conjunction with understanding them and understanding your system. It's really important you understand the DI or EI or the set ranges and so forth of your system, that when you're manipulating things, you're going to be capable of utilising this and providing images that both have a great image quality, but are also maintaining a really optimal dose and as low as dose as you can achieve. Okay. So thank you for your time. I hope that you got something out of this and it's been valuable for you. These are just a handful of references I've used, but there's so much literature out there on a lot of the stuff I've talked about today. Please chase that up. A lot of it's in physics journals, but there's also plenty in the radiography journals. Thank you for your time. I hope you've learned something, and it looks like I might have question time. So if there is, and you've got questions, please reach out to me. Thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate it.
Adam, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. I think it was like absolutely fantastic to see, like going back to basics and really like the fundamentals of radiography that we all really need to know moving forward to make sure that we are optimizing the dose to our patients. And that we've got Adam online. Before we just go to a couple of questions, I just want to remind everyone that May 31st coming up is No Tobacco Day. And the Isrrt are running a campaign. Check out the details on the Isrrt Facebook page, and you can take a picture and post it on the Facebook on the Facebook page and tag the Isrrt in your pictures as well. And this is a campaign that we run every year that's in association with the World Health Organization as well. I also want to just remind everyone that next week in Hong Kong is the Isrrt World Congress. And hopefully some of you are attending there, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of you at the Congress itself. Adam, let's have a chat. Mate, I'm surprised you made it all the way through in under an hour. Well done. Good job.
It took me it took me a little while to get that done, but yeah, down to under an hour. It was a pretty mean feat.
Yep.
It's an area I'm passionate about, Steve. So, it was quite enjoyable to do, and I hope that it's helped a lot of people, particularly students starting out. It's always hard to get your head around it. So it's very basic, as I said, back to basics, but it's hopefully a good refresher for a lot of people, or something new for others.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. There was a question that came through on the chat, which a couple of people actually answered as we were going along. But I just want to get your take on it as well. And that question was, what is DI? What does it stand for, and how does it work?
Yeah, I think I saw it in the chat. Yeah, look, so DI, as I introduced at the start, and people probably jumped in part way through and missed that, so it probably made it a bit difficult for some people. The DI is we use it. We've got a GE system, and when we did that study, we utilised the GE system, and it utilises the DI, which is a deviation index. So the deviation index is it works on. It's not as assigned or more robust as the EI. So the exposure index is a literal measure of the exposure at the detector, as opposed to DI, which is a deviation from it. So it's basically saying this is how far it's deviated from what the dose expected. So it's not super scientifically robust, but particularly with the GE system and other systems that use the DI, it's a pretty simple way of going. Where you've got, one step is 25%, which you're familiar with every time you step up an MAS, and doubling a halving is about 3. So it's a deviation index. It's literally a kind of an easy guide for radiographers, and most people, a lot of vendors started putting it in because different vendors had different values for EI and so forth, and the DI gave a bit more consistency, so radiographers could sort of lend across a bit better. So that's the deviation index. It's really just simply a measure of, it's kind of a rough measure of the dose to the detector, or a signal.
Yeah, and I think you're right there, and I think it's good to know that it's a bit kind of more vendor neutral as opposed to the EI, because I think with things like your EI and your SI values and that they do differ depending upon which vendor you're actually using and that. So something that's consistent along the different vendors, I think, is very helpful to those, particularly those who are working in places where there's multiple vendors on the same area. The other question, Adam, was about grid use. Actually, this is my question. You talked about the grid law in terms of, you've got your own grid law being 12 centimeters is when you kind of start using the grid, and that you kind of explained that when it was related to something like the knee, for example, and that do you apply the same concept when you're looking at the torso, like your chest and your abdomen?
Yeah, so yeah, I do. The abdomen is a pretty obvious one, because typically the abdomen is going to be well over sort of 10 to 12 centimeters. So it's very rare or very unlikely that you're going to not use a grid for an abdomen, because it is almost always going to be that it sort of comes into that size. The chest is a bit different, and the chest, I do find that it can be, some people will use it sort of standard, and some people will tend to err on the side of not using it. The chest is a tricky one. Whenever we were doing exposure, the chest is almost that, it's just that anomaly that makes things very difficult. If you think about the heart value layer, it doesn't relate because it's just so aerated. So with the chest, I tend to go on again, it's the size, it's the thickness, but the 12 centimeters needs to be much greater because the tissue thickness you're going through, the majority of it is aerated. So if you've got a larger patient, so I wouldn't be going for something like, say, 12 centimetres. That might be increased by an extra 5 or whatever it might be, as a loose rule of thumb. And it's something that different radiographers will find different, but you should be finding that same rule of thumb. You should be trying to look at something like, roughly how many centimetres of tissue thickness, how thick do I need to go through before I want to start employing it? It will be much greater for a chest because a lot of the tissue inside is aerated lung. So to be honest, I don't have a real hard and fast rule I tend to use for chest, but it would follow a similar principle. It just would probably be a bit thicker. Does that help?
Yeah, I was going to say, because I think if we apply the thing to pediatrics, when it comes to chest X-rays, like we would very rarely use a grid for chest X-rays in pediatrics, and then I think it's the same kind of concept as what you're talking about because of the aeration of the lungs. And to be honest, I think a lot of people use grids in chest X-rays for adults. I think just because it's it's a universal thing that I think that they use in that. But when you think about some of the people that you're actually X-raying for chest X-ray in an adult centre, sometimes you probably don't need to use a grid, but I think you just do because you do it for everyone, right?
Yeah. And we are creatures of habit. So radiography, and part of the reason I've sort of chose this because we tend to be creatures of habit, and sometimes we have these rules, but we don't know why we've got these rules. So part of this was to try and lend that to it. In the pediatrics, and when we work the pediatrics at Sunshine here at our hospital, I don't know that we'd use the grid almost the same, probably the same at children's. We don't really use it very often at all, if at all, because the
Yeah.
kids are not really that thick that you don't really go, and certainly doses of a significant consideration. So grid use is a really tricky one. And again, I talk about a 12 to 14 centimetre thickness, but even then you take certain liberties with that, because sometimes the 14 centimetres you might go, actually, it's okay, I'm happy to cop this. And sometimes we know it's actually really important. So again, it's everything I've said today needs to be in consideration with what are you trying to achieve.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Adam, I've got another question. It's a bit of a curveball question that's come through on the chat as well. Can you provide some simple exposure selection adjustments when it comes to compensating filters?
Oh, a good one. Okay, yeah. So I didn't touch on filters deliberately because it tends to be a bit confusing. When you run out of time, there's different elements of filters that just created a lot of confusion. My students tend to get confused by that. So I didn't really go into detail with that. But a compensatory filter, probably the simple way, and it actually goes back to the half value layer, and again, thinking about the thickness of tissue you're going through. The way I would use a compensatory filter, and a compensatory filter is basically where you've got sort of a discrepancy in tissue thickness. You might have one this thick and one sort of this thick. You've got two areas, and you're going to use a compensatory filter here to try and even that density out. So in that case, the filter will take care of evening the density out. All you would need to worry about is setting the exposure of this part here that doesn't have the filter on it. So if you think that the classic example is a hip, you do a roll hip and you put the filter on. So you put the filter, and the filter is going to sort of come in and take over from this point here, where there's a lack of or a significant disparity in the thickness. The exposure you're setting is to set for here, where the thickest part is. So aim to set for there and penetrate there and demonstrate that well, and the filter will take care of the rest. It will just even the density out. And that's a mistake I see a lot of people make. They tend to, particularly students, find it hard. You increase. So often if I'm doing a hip, for example, I'll collimate down from the pelvis pretty tightly, and I go up by 25% because of the collimation. And they go, you go up because of the filter. Actually, no, I'm not going for the filter because the thickness here is roughly the same. I'm going because I've collimated down, and you explain that. Now, sometimes the thickness might be a bit different. Actually, I think it's a bit higher, so I'm going to change that. But simple rule for using filters, really simple way. Put the filter to cover the area you want, set your exposure to get through the thickness where there's no filter. And that's simple. So again, use your half value layer. Okay, it's actually 5 centimeters thicker than I normally would, so I want to give double this, and away you go.
But don't set your exposure factor until after you've collimated, right?
Until after you've collimated correctly. Yeah. And then put the filter on and do everything after you've collimated. So actually it's interesting because I always teach my students to collimate first. Set the exposure, walk in the room, collimate to a preset size. We've got auto censoring now. Preset to a set centimetre size, and then don't touch it because you know it's going to fit on. You just need to position correctly. And that's a good way to keep yourself on track to collimate effectively.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. That's wonderful. Adam, we're out of time. Absolute great job. I can't thank you enough for what you've done. And it's been wonderful. It's been a great experience to be able to put all this stuff together and make sure that we all are aware of how we can optimize the dose to the patients and how we can make sure that our image quality is absolute top notch. It's been great to chat to you as well. Always a pleasure. And for everyone on
Hong Kong, mate, be good.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing you in Hong Kong, mate. Be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for everyone for logging in online. For those going to Hong Kong, we'll see you next week. Make sure you come up and say hi to me and hi to Adam as well. And looking forward to seeing everyone. Okay, thanks very much. Take care.